Vlad Dracula, more infamously known by his nickname Vlad the Impaler, earned his title by ordering thousands of his enemies to be executed by impalement during his reign from 1456 to 1462. As part of the execution process, he would have the stakes that still held the impaled victims arranged all over the castle grounds, creating a field of bodies that surrounded his domain. Accordingly, his legacy lives on as being one of the most brutal rulers in world history, while the sheer number of victims that fell to this gruesome death are what make Vlad Dracula so well known. Any historian or history buff will tell you that he was certainly not the first to put it in practice. Instead, the method of impalement was one of the many execution methods favored by one of history's greatest empires, the Romans. As we discussed in our previous video, crucifixion was a popular and horrific execution method often used by Roman rulers for over 500 centuries. However, they also used another method that some argue was even more horrific than crucifixion, if you could even believe that to be possible. With that being said, some of the details in this video will be quite graphic, so viewer discretion is advised. Otherwise, please sit back, relax, and let's dive into the dark Roman history of impalement. A practice more ancient than Rome. Much like crucifixion, it is assumed that the Romans more than likely adopted the practice of impalement from the Persians and other Mesopotamian empires around the 6th century BCE, who, in turn, most likely adopted it from the Assyrians. However, impalement is probably one of the most ancient forms of extreme execution, with written records dating back to the 18th century BCE. To put it in perspective, in Hammurabi's code, the earliest form of written law, line 153 under the family section, states, "If a man's wife, for the sake of another, has caused her husband to be killed, that woman shall be impaled." Despite its ancient roots and heavy association with Vlad Dracula, it is the Assyrian Empire that is most notable for using this practice on a societal scale, with several relief carvings depicting prisoners and slaves being impaled, having been discovered over years of excavation. But what made the Assyrian use of impalement so unique wasn't so much its frequency or method, but its victims. While it was mostly typical for only criminals, slaves, or war prisoners to be executed in such macabre manners, the Assyrians would sometimes extend this sentence to the persecuted victim's family as well. Although this was a rare occurrence, it doesn't take away from the fact that it lends to the idea that children were no strangers to this horrific punishment as well. That being said, while the Assyrians could be credited with their sense of brutality based on their choice of victims, the Romans are more infamous for their ability to make an excruciating death even more sadistic. Lost in translation and in time. The practice of impalement is believed to be the inspiration behind crucifixion. Ironically enough, some have even theorized that the latter was meant to be a less excruciating, yet equally shameful adaptation of the practice. However, there is often debate about which methods were actually used in most scenarios. The Latin root word crux actually has several translations, one of which refers directly to the vertical stake that can be used for either crucifixion or impalement. In some contexts, the word crux can even refer to the act of hanging, or it can be translated to generally mean torture, torment, and misery. Similarly, the Greek word staros translates to stake and usually refers to an upright pole. However, the New Testament, written with Greek terminology, refers to a staros as the cross. To make matters even more interesting, these varying translations have led some to theorize that Jesus of Nazareth was impaled rather than crucified. But without much detail or context, it is often quite difficult for historians to determine which method was used in the few written accounts of executions that do exist. However, some records give us a glimpse into how the Romans integrated this practice into their society. Despite historians' claims that impalement was introduced to Rome in roughly the 6th century BCE, it could be argued that the Romans were inspired by this practice much earlier, based on the written accounts of the most well-known Roman ever to exist, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is recognized as one of Rome's most outstanding military leaders of all time. Still, he is more infamously known for declaring himself as Rome's dictator for life in 44 BCE, as well as his brutal assassination shortly following this declaration. In 53 BCE, Caesar wrote a book called Commentaries on the Gallic War, in which he outlined his experiences and justifications during his conquest of Gaul, a Celtic region of Europe that consisted of modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Western Germany. In his book, he details a tactic he used, setting up many spikes in covered trenches around his military camps, effectively setting up a trap for incoming enemies. As their adversaries advanced, they would fall into these pits and be impaled by the spikes below. This tactic was referred to as Roman barbed wire, but it was also considered an exaggerated tale by Caesar for millennia, as there was zero evidence to support these claims. However, that very recently began to change. In 2016, a drone captured images of what researchers initially thought were tractor marks in a field near an excavation site in the German town of Bad Ems. But upon further investigation and research, it was determined that these strange markings were indicators of a trench, which coincided with 2 previously undiscovered military camps in that area. With this exciting discovery at hand, excavation of the trenches began, and just last year, in February 2023, archaeologists from Goethe University in Frankfurt made a groundbreaking discovery that proved Caesar's claims may have had a sense of truth to them after all. 40 wooden stakes and a Roman coin dating back to 43 AD were found preserved deep within the soil, arranged in a manner that suggested they were used as a defense mechanism rather than a means of political execution. While these camps existed long after Caesar's time, it lends credibility to the idea that his tactics were potentially a great success that inspired future generals for future generations. Although there may not be many specific accounts of Roman impalement to dive deeper in, they did leave behind enough details on how the sentence was carried out to conclude that Roman execution methods are the epitome of cruel and unusual. Depending on how it was carried out, impalement could either be swift yet painful or slow and agonizing. Regardless of the speed or exact process chosen, the goals of impalement were much like that of crucifixion, to humiliate the victims and to deter others from committing similar offenses. A fate worse than death. Following their sentencing and a brutal beating or flaying, the stakes on which the victims would be impaled were first set up in very public places, such as along public roads or even within entertainment arenas before large groups of spectators. Sometimes, the stakes would be sharpened to allow death to come quicker, but sometimes the ends were left with blunter tips to allow for a slower fate. Once positioned, the stakes were coated with a slick substance such as oil or animal fat. From here, the actual impalement could take place several ways. In some instances, such as driving the stake directly through the chest or abdomen, death was instantaneous. But in most cases, the victims would be hoisted over the spikes and forced down upon them vertically, with the spikes being driven either up the pelvic or rectal cavities and through the mouth, shoulder, or chest. Depending on exactly how the stake was positioned at this stage and the sharpness of the stake, death could range from instantaneously to up to several days. In some rarer cases, as part of the arena spectacles, the stakes and the condemned would be laid on the ground first rather than upright, and the victim's limbs would be spread out and tied to several animals, such as horses or oxen. Upon command, the animals would begin to walk leisurely, slowly dragging the victim partially onto the stake. Afterwards, officials would lift the stake with the victim on it and firmly plant it into the ground, letting gravity do the rest and leaving the victims to suffer. As with crucifixion, the ultimate causes of death from impalement came from a variety of factors. While the trauma of having a stick driven through your entire body seems like enough to cause your demise, it wasn't always as cut and dry depending on the scenario. For some victims, the ultimate cause of death could be attributed to infection, hemorrhaging, and extended trauma from organs being slowly torn apart as gravity takes its course. But if you were one of the ones who lasted several days on the stake, there's also a chance that you would have met your end with Roman officials dousing you, and the stake with flammable substances before setting you ablaze. As I'm sure you can guess, once the victim ultimately passed away, their corpse would remain on the stake for decay and nature to consume what was left. Because those sentenced to impalement were also denied proper burials, their remains would be thrown into mass graves, that is, if the scavengers even left any. With all of this in mind, it's understandable that some would consider this to be a worse fate than crucifixion, especially if you were one of the unlucky ones who didn't perish right away. But what do you think? The end of an era. The act of impaling was abolished within the Roman Empire in 4th century AD, along with crucifixion, under the word of Emperor Constantine. While it mainly did die down following this declaration, as we all know, impalement saw a massive resurgence during the Middle Ages, when Vlad Dracula took impalement to a level no one else in history could ever reach. It is estimated that during his time in power, he ordered the impalement of at least 20,000 men, women, and children of the Ottoman Empire, although some sources estimate that the number could be more significant. In total, it is believed that roughly 60,000 to 80,000 people were executed under his rule. So we may never truly know just how many people succumbed to this terrible fate under his hand. Seeing the atrocities of Vlad the Impaler seemed to inspire cultures to abandon the practice for good until the spring of 1915. During the course of WWI, the Armenian Christian population was met with a devastating loss as the Ottoman Empire nearly wiped them out completely. Referred to as the first genocide of the 20th century, the death toll is estimated to be anywhere from 664,000 to possibly as many as 1.2 million people. Despite these staggering numbers, the Turkish government still refuses to acknowledge this event as a genocide, stating explicitly on their website that the Armenian deaths do not constitute genocide, and that the Armenians took arms against their own government, which rendered them subject to relocation. However, survivors of that fateful year beg to differ, such as one Armenian woman named Aurora Mardiganian. Born as Arshalouis Mardiganian, Aurora was just 14 when Turkish forces first invaded her home on Easter Sunday, April 4th. She was one of many young women who faced unspeakable horrors after being placed in a prison camp, and one of the very few who survived. In fact, at one point, she was narrowly spared from crucifixion after soldiers came up one cross short, so she was forced to watch the ordeal instead. In 1917, Aurora found sanctuary after finally making her way to New York, where she met a young screenwriter named Harvey Gates. Harvey Gates was fascinated by Aurora's story, and he helped her complete her memoir on this dark period in her life called Ravished Armenia. Gates ultimately helped Aurora's story reach an even bigger audience after turning it into a movie production of the same name in 1919. However, Aurora stated that the film could never truly depict the horrors that actually took place. In Chapter 10 of her memoir, Aurora recounts a particular time when she witnessed soldiers impaling multiple young girls at a time with their swords. She writes, "It was a game, a contest. Each Chechen tried to seize as many girls as he could and fling them upon the sword points so that they were killed in one throw, in one gallop along the line. Only the most skillful of them succeeded in impaling more than one girl. Some lifted the second from the ground, but missed the sword in their speed, and the girl, with broken bones or bleeding wounds, was held up in the line again to be used in the game a second time, praying that this time the Chechen's aim would be true and the sword put an end to her torture. Ultimately, Aurora's story and the story of the Armenian genocide as a whole is a long and complex one that honestly deserves its own episode, but that is another conversation for another time and another channel. Yet we felt that it was worth mentioning in this context to give you an idea of how impalement has still claimed a place in our modern world and to prove that history always finds a way to repeat itself in various forms. However, if you are interested in learning more about this historical event and about Aurora's story specifically, you can find her full book publicly online. Although it is an extremely sad and graphic story, it's certainly worth a read in terms of gaining a first-hand perspective on exactly what part of this community went through. Conclusion. If you've stomached through all the gruesome details so far, you'll be happy to know that this brings us to the end of our journey. Although there aren't many specific accounts of impalement, the details that have been uncovered still give us an idea of just how ruthless the Romans truly were. Considering the instances we have covered so far, it's easy to understand how they rose to and maintained such a high rank in the world's powers for so long. It also sheds light on just how much they have influenced figures and societies alike long after their existence. Even though the Roman Empire has technically come to an end, it's safe to say that their legacy has truly left a piercing mark on human history. We would love to hear your thoughts and comments down below. We'll see you in the next one, and until then, keep conquering with the power of knowledge.